Let's go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for coming tonight to this presentation of the Unholy Trinity. And I would like to introduce Joe Blankenship, who is the president of Americans United for Separation of Church and State, Greater Phoenix Chapter. And Joe is also a board member of Secular AZ, and he's been with us for over 5 years now. And before this, he had a successful career as a business professional with responsibilities in strategic planning for 2 Fortune 500 companies. He was a CFO of a subsidiary of one of these Fortune 500 companies, and he was also the president and CEO of a public company that addressed recycling and recovery of household and commercial waste. With Secular AZ, Joe has recruited speakers for our successful secular studies program that we present at the Arizona legislature. And Joe currently writes on public policy issues and presents his conclusions to interested audiences. His current topics of interest include quality education and separation of church and state. And Joe, I am going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Lindsay, and welcome to all that are there. I appreciate your giving me your dinner time. This is a presentation for Americans United. And I've called it an unholy trinity, the trinity being oligarchs for a reason, the Republican Party, as doers for the oligarchs, and Christian nationalists who are complicit voters in the whole issue of what we'll be talking about. In terms of oligarchs, we look at what I call the market world. The reason they are in this is for low taxes, low wages for corporations, no unions, no corporate regulations, also to privatize education. They look at as people are consumers, not citizens. This all started in the early 50s when in a certain university economists formed a philosophy of personal choice and was more important than social cohesion and democracy. The free to choose ideology was begun by the Chicago School at the University of Chicago. It became so popular that even the Democrats bought into it. And remember welfare queens and their Cadillacs? Remember President Clinton limiting unemployment insurance to 5 years, cutting food stamps? These policies continue through to this day among Republican states. And like Arizona, that pays only $240 a week for unemployment, it still continues to hurt. Charter schools or vouchers or tax credits for scholarship accounts that rob public schools of much needed money. Arizona is the poster child for ALEC, American Legislative Exchange Council, and every tax reduction possible to lower the amount of money available for public schools is taken. Now we're 49th ranked school system in the US, so that poor kids have no possible way to have a chance for equality of opportunity or good jobs and social achievement. So who are these oligarchs who say we get our first and the poor can take over what's left over? Well, start with the DeVos family out of Minnesota who started Amway in the 1950s. And then there was the Prince family that made a fortune serving the automobile makers with parts during the development of the automobile industry. Well, Betsy Prince and became Betsy DeVos when she married into the DeVos clan. The Cook Family Fund, the American Enterprise Institute, and now pay for many of the think tanks and most of the Republican candidates that the House and Senate that continue to do their bidding in legislative matters. Well, how did the Trinity coalesce? For some time, the old men, mostly in the South, could look at the changing demographics and continuing immigration into the US and know that someday they would become the minority when it comes to voting. Their projections was that this would happen somewhere around 2030. They wanted to do something that would restore a 19th century patriarchy and would continue their dominance beyond that 2030s. The Christian nationalists wanted some way to influence legislation that would favor their denomination, and the Republicans wanted a way to stay in control of the government. Well, enter the right-wing Christian conservatives with Tim LaHaye as the head of the moral majority. Other prominent Christians over time have been Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell Sr., and donors such as Eric Prince and Betsy DeVos. Secrecy has been its hallmark to insulate it from what its members considered were the liberal bias of the news media. The culmination was the Council for the National Policy, founded in 1981. Recent speakers at the CNP have been Kevin McCarthy in 2018. There he asserted that the American political climate was increasingly belittling Christian conservatives for their beliefs and forcing Christians out of the public square. In August of 2020, President Trump attended a CNP meeting where he gave a speech. And at a meeting in August of 2020, one of the attendees warned of plans by Democrats to steal the 2020 election. He said that if they get away with that, what happens? Democracy is finished because they usher in totalitarianism. So looking down below at the beliefs of the CNP, will limiting the size of government allow Americans greater freedom to reach their fullest potential? Was this nation created based on Judeo-Christian values? And will our culture flourish if we uphold them? Does the CNP really believe the premise that all people are created equal? Well, how does that stack up when we want to control women's health, discriminate against same-sex marriage, promote conversion therapy for homosexuals and transgender people, and acting as a Pluto theocracy? As George Costanza made famous about saying one thing and believing another, it's not a lie if you believe. What oligarchs believe in now is not democracy. Government by the people or government for the people. So let's flip to the Republicans. What is the Republican Party's philosophy? Power at all cost. Privatizing education, no social benefits, no governing plan. Most importantly, gerrymandering and voter suppression to maintain power at all costs. The resources for the Republicans are the oligarchs for donations to help keep them in power, donations from corporations to help keep them in power, think tanks to provide framing statements, the Supreme Court to gut voting rights and allow unfettered corporate political contributions, and the Christian nationalist voter to keep them in office. A motto for the Republicans: better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven. This is from John Milton's poem, Paradise Lost. It kind of goes with an earlier stanza in the same poem. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell and a hell of heaven. What do Republicans not believe in? Democracy, government of the people or for the people. Becoming tools of the Republicans and the oligarchs is okay with the Christian nationalists, as long as they meet their objectives. Eventually, dominion of the government. Still going on the basis that America was formed as a Christian nation, and that Christian nationalists believe they should run the country based on Christian values. But even now, they have the Supreme Court, so they can discriminate toward LGBTQ, and it appears to be able to control women's health as well. and get money for religious schools. In public schools, they will continue to push intelligent design rather than follow the science of DNA and evolution. The Christian nationalists still have substantial resources. Keeping Christian voters, meaning keeping their congregations' belief in the biblical faith. After Trump, the ministers had no compunction about electioneering from the pulpit. Trump told them he would get rid of the Johnson Amendment. Even with a diminishing congregation, they receive considerable donations enhanced by Christian TV and radio. And the foundations provide large Christian organizations like the Moral Majority and the Southern Baptist Convention funds that can be funneled down to selected congregations. More recently, the Christian nationalists can depend on the Supreme Court to say that it's okay to discriminate or refuse government funding social services to people if it's against their sincerely held religious beliefs. What the Christian nationalists do not believe in is democracy, government by the people, for the people. One example of a significant ruling in the Supreme Court is the 2010 court overturned 100 years of law that said that corporations could not spend money on political campaigns. And as late as 2002, the McCain-Feingold was still closing loopholes in existing campaign finance laws. And if exacerbating protected voter rules was not enough, 5 justices were unhappy with the limited nature of the case before them, so they changed the case to give them an opportunity to change the law so that corporations could be people. Critics have said that the court's First Amendment analysis was deeply flawed. It was wrong to say that corporations were equivalent to people as speakers. Corporations lack the attributes that matter most in expressive communication, and they have no consciences, no beliefs, no feelings, no thoughts, no desires. Justice Stevens said, corporate personhood can be a useful legal fiction, Stevens said, but corporations are not themselves members of we the people, by and whom for which the Constitution was established. In 2013, the court struck down large portions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Chief Justice Roberts made the astute observation that our country had changed, but what has not changed is the desire for Republicans to gerrymander in their districts and impose as many voting restrictions as can be dreamed upon. Just look at the number of voting suppression bills introduced in 40 states in 2021. The courts have come under substantial scrutiny because of the preferences they are providing through religious freedom bills. After the rush to get Amy Coney Barrett nominated and confirmed with Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death, Democratic senators put together a synopsis of what has been happening in the courts, particularly as to how it affects voting rights and political contributions. The book, Captured Courts, was drafted in 2020 by leaders in the Democratic caucus. It was prepared by Chuck Schumer, Senate Democratic leader, and Senator Debbie Stabenow and Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. Another book that I've used as a source for this talk was a 2020 edition of The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and Betrayal of America by Tom Hartman. Now we are seeing legislative efforts to change the Supreme Court and possibly the district courts as well. One proposed law in the voting area is For the People Act that would rectify most of the attempts at voter suppression and gerrymandering that is currently being introduced in 40 state legislatures. Striking directly at the Supreme Court, a bill has been introduced in the Senate to expand the Supreme Court to 13 justices. And President Biden has impaneled a commission to provide him an assessment of the Supreme Court in the next 90 days. The possibilities of expanding the court or setting term limits are on the table. Illustrating the partisan divide, and you won't be able to read all of this, the Supreme Court, the book Captured Courts, shows an overwhelming 80 cases during the Roberts Court that advanced partisan goals with a 5-4 vote under the Roberts Court, meaning all 5 conservatives were voting, all 5 of what we would call the liberals were voting against it. With Justice Barrett, the breakdown for the subsequent courses today is likely to be 6-3 votes for the conservative cause. These cases helped Republicans win elections. They protected the corporations from accountability. They took away certain civil rights and pushed a far right social agenda, generally favoring the religious right and the gun lobby. To illustrate the militancy of some of the members of the court, Justice Thomas and Alito have called for someone to bring them a case where they could overturn Obergefell, the case that approved same-sex marriage. The Captured Court books referred to some of the cases recently that were making law instead of just interpreting the law as written. If Chief Justice Roberts thought that our country was changed from 1965 to 2013, or 48 years, why do most of the conservative judges feel they must interpret the law as the founders intended in 1789? Surely 232 years reflects significantly greater change than 48 years in social, demographic, economic, and cultural ways, particularly in recognizing the dignity of all people, regardless of race, gender, color, sexual orientation, or country of origin. Originalism is a philosophy taught by the Federalist Society, where most of the recent appointees to the Supreme Court have been recommended. It is mostly identified with the Southern plantational white men and does not necessarily work as well for women, Negroes, recent immigrants, or poor people. So what does the Supreme Court believe? My belief is that they do not believe in democracy, government by the people or for the people. We can go back about 60, 70 years when Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis said, we must make our choice. We may have a democracy, or we may have wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both. The result of the conservative ideology, according to the second book that I had there, we have one of the most corrupt political systems in the developed world. For nearly 40 years, we have had billionaires and the big corporations writing legislation to benefit themselves in federal, state, and local levels. At the state and local level, it's been the American Legislative Exchange Council. And Arizona is by far the poster child for advancing the agenda of ALEC. The central push of the extreme conservative bend in the courts is the Federalist Society. The central ideology is the neoliberal, anti-government, anti-regulation agenda. Trump acknowledged that the Federalist Society had picked his judges. And as of May 2020, 86% of Trump's judge candidates were from the Federalist Society. The Federalist Society has extensive resources for expanding its agenda. The oligarchs and the corporations still send them loads of money to ensure its conservative policies. So where do we go from here? Well, I'm approaching the secularist revenge. Since 2010, US population growth has all been people of color. It is indicated that in the 2020 US Census, we will show an absolute decline in the number of white people in the US. But the rapid secularization comes in the adults in their 20s and 30s. In 1986, 10% of the 20s group said that they were unaffiliated in terms of any religion. In 1996, that was 20%. And in 2019, for folks in the 20s, that was up to 40%. A recent poll showed that adults under 30, only 25% identified as white Christian. And here's what the Gallup poll presented just probably 2 months ago in terms of church membership among US adults. And it is now below 50%, the first time in history. The lowest count ever seen in a religious court count. There's an ad running now that says in the next 10 years, technology will be the most significant changes than in all of the last century. Most noteworthy, electric vehicles and autonomous ride sharing, orbital aerospace, internet access, and space tourism, and in the health field, CRISPR and DNA sequencing. In my opinion, those folks from the reservation are not going to be pleased when they cannot keep up with the technology that is being advanced. So now we're looking at the mission of Americans United of Greater Phoenix. What do we want to do? We want to engage interfaith groups to get more involved in stopping discrimination among their congregations, trying to reverse the decline in public schools, educate political organizations in maintaining American democracy, and hopefully engaging nonprofits and other social networks to protect the health and human rights of their constituency. Try to get the Democratic Party to be more vocal about educating the citizens of Arizona on ALEC and how they control policy versus helping citizens. Work with the education community to show the benefits of a better education and equal opportunity to emerge from poverty. And some of the more resources for data from this presentation is from The Power Worshippers by Catherine Stewart, and a little bit earlier book called The Shadow Network by Ann Nelson. So I have told you what I have in mind. Would like some questions, some conversation as to where we go from here.
Howard has entered a question into the Q&A, and I'll read it to you here, Joe. He says, some libertarians are good on some issues, legalization of what are now victimless crimes, such as drugs and sex work. Many also oppose the US having neoconservative militaristic foreign policy. Depending on the case, Trump at least did not start any new wars, although he abandoned several of our treaty obligations to appease neocons like John Bolton. Is it possible to work with libertarians on some issues where we have agreement?
Of course, you can always make a choice. As was shown in our slide on choice, whether there are libertarian or neo-libertarian or conservative or of the particular item that you want to support and to try to achieve. Certainly in some cases, it would help when we have filibusters in the Senate that sometimes you need to go along with the party to get some real work done. But as indicated there, not everyone, even in the Democratic Party, wants to get rid of the filibuster. So yes, you can select and choose.
Diane Post entered a comment in response, and she notes that sex work is not a victimless crime. Women are abused, and the buying and selling of women harms all women. So I do think that is an important point to make as well.
I wish I could make every point that comes to mind.
I know. If you have questions or comments, please enter them in the Q&A or in the chat, and we can discuss.
I would like someone's opinion around the opportunity of beginning a secular revenge in some of our AU or secular coalition activities, such that we can be more positive in and more of a larger occupancy of making these things happen. Any responses?
I think we have a quiet group tonight.
Okay. Well, I can be quiet too.
If you have comments, you can also raise your hand and I can turn your speaking capability on too. Okay, Joe, do you see the comment from Diane in the chat?
I do not. I'm still on a.
Okay, she says, Diane Post says, people do not realize what Christian nationalism is. We need a social media campaign to let people know what it means and why it is dangerous.
I would agree. And I've been trying to do some of that with a couple of interfaith groups. Just recently, I gave a presentation to an interfaith group that was on experiencing interfaith. And I discussed humanism in that, in an effort that was about 20 denominations. And my humanist speech was just one of those.
And Diane is also saying, young people who know how to use social media, and Diane, you're so right. We need to move past just Facebook and get onto Instagram and TikTok and the places where my kids are that I don't use or know how to use. But that's where they are, and that's where we need to really do our outreach. I agree.
I've been very interested in something called Citizens Saturday, a program by Eric Liu, and would like to entertain one of these organizations, or perhaps more than one, beginning to set up a Citizen Saturday here in Phoenix. If we don't begin to engage the millennials and the people who are now just set out as unaffiliated, we will never expand our opportunity for growth for these things that we're trying to attempt.
I put a link to the Citizen Saturdays in the chat. I hope that that is correct. We have A comment from D, who says there are 26 members of ALEC in our legislature. Most of the really bad voter suppression and other bad bills come from them. I have the tracking if you want it. And Joe, just in case not everyone knows what ALEC is, would you like to explain a little bit about what they do?
Well, the American Legislative Council is something that was started by corporations and some of our oligarch friends to control particularly state senates. It is primarily pushed by Charles Koch, funded by them, and those same people will fund the electioneering for those 24 people that are members of ALEC. So we have been with ALEC for now some 30 years, and they've been in control of the legislative sessions since then. The Goldwater Institute actually went over to the education department to write the bills for vouchers and charter schools.
Okay, thank you. We have another comment from an anonymous attendee saying sex work victimizes men and transgender people as well. Also, how can you call drugs a victimless crime? People die of overdoses every day. Also, some good points there. Okay, and in our chat, we have a question from Howard, who says, what do we do about alt-right atheists? Richard Spencer being the most egregious example. Even Sam Harris has denied the concept of Islamophobia, which reflects the position of Ayaan Hirsi.
I think that people should be able to reflect their either religious belief or none thereof. However, I think we make more headway if we can acknowledge that we respect other people's faiths and beliefs, as long as they do not hurt other people. And that question came up in my presentation to the Experiencing Interfaith. The question was, do I believe in God? I said, no. Do I believe in miracles? I said, no. But I don't belittle anyone who says that they do, as long as they don't try to impose that on other people.
A question from Facebook from Alex, who says, groups like this and others have a massive hurdle to overcome in the form of social cynicism, not apathy, but a sincere revulsion in the form of a, quote, burn it all down, unquote, mentality. How would you propose we overcome this obstacle?
Well, I think that's one of the things that HSGP is doing right now in a particular community event that they're trying to do to help the immigrants coming in. And it's going to be outreach in terms of working within the communities and showing them that you're just not the radical atheist, if you will, and that secularism has a purpose for the separation of church and state.
Yeah, Joe's talking about the secular day of action, secular week of action, and I will put a link to that in the chat in just a minute, to HSGP's program for that. A question from Kent. To what extent is Christian nationalism similar to white domination?
White domination?
Assuming he means like white supremacy.
Well, sometimes it's hard to determine a separation. However, white supremacy, if we look at it in terms of the view of immigrants or people of color, is, in my view, more severe than just saying a Christian nationalist who wants to look at, or who wants to have control of the government. But in many, many ways, they're similar. There are some things that you can always point out that would be different.
A question from Pauline, who asks, please explain the advantage of expanding the Supreme Court. Won't that open the door to manipulating the number of justices depending on which party is in power?
Well, a yes and a no. If the Supreme Court, which now has 6 conservatives and 3, let's call them liberals or progressives, at one time, for the last 20 years and during the Roberts Court, it's been 5-4, but typically John Roberts would sometimes vote with the progressives, but it all depends on who elects or who submits to the Congress, the judges, and their ideology going in. And it's really, really important to know that. That's why when Obama tried to get Garland on in 2019, and Mitch McConnell did everything possible to make sure it didn't happen, so that they could get what they got out of Trump, and that was 3 very conservative justices.
A comment from Howard, who says, some atheists don't want to be associated with socialism for fear of being tarred with the USSR, as happened during the McCarthy era.
I think they need to get a definition of socialism embedded, so that in a socialist economy, that means the government has the means of production. In America, government does not have the means of production. That is one of the things that the Republicans like to what I call frame a issue that is not particularly true. We are not dealing with socialism when we want to help the poor, to feed children, to have good schools. That's a part of a democracy that's working for the people. Socialism in and itself, if you go with the Marx kind of definition, says that, okay, if we have all of the production in our hands, then we have the control of everything else in the country too. That is not true in the US.
Paul has a hand raised, so I'm going to give them the ability to talk. Here you go.
Unmute. There we go. All right. Yeah, when you were talking about victimless crimes, my ears perked up there. Just because an activity has potential dangers doesn't mean it's bad. We tried this in the 1920s by saying, oh, alcohol, bad, let's make it illegal. And that worked out so well. So I think that the current trend of relaxing some of these prohibitions, I think is a good thing. And yes, there are people who are harmed by it, but there are also people who can now come out of the woodwork, out of the shadows, and actually get the help they need. Because, you know, a lot of people use drugs to quiet down the mental effects of the trauma that they were suffering. and making them criminals and throwing them in a cage, not very therapeutic. Yes, there's the isolated incidents of the guy who sits in prison and figures it out and goes, oh, I'm glad I got arrested for doing meth because I was going to be dead in 6 months and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, you can always find those isolated cases. But for the most part, dialing down the violence of the state against basically peaceful people is a good thing.
Thank you, Paul.
Well, we're allowing marijuana in many, many, many states now. That for a long, long time was a ugly drug according to many, and discovering that, well, we can get along using it in the proper way and letting it go. I wish we could be more concerned about guns and how they're handled and who gets them and why.
A question from Diane, a discussion question. She says, do we have to, quote, respect the beliefs of others? I find it hard to respect beliefs that we come from Thetans who lived in a volcano, or someone found Egyptian coins in the US and someone else translated them, or Jesus was born of a virgin, etc. It is hard to respect belief in such nonsense. I can agree that you have every right to believe that if you like, but you have no right to force that on anyone else. But I have a hard time saying I respect it.
Well, I agree with Diane that in terms of one of the denominations in the group that I am in has a Scientology deal, and I certainly do not respect Scientology, but I accept, I'm not necessarily saying that I approve of, but I accept that they have a right to believe what they do. But no, I do not, as she said, favor it.
From D, who says, we need to aggressively point out the evil of the evangelicals like Mike Pompeo, who believe in the rapture. What kind of terrible person believes that if Jerusalem falls with their help, God will rise them up to be on his side? What kind of God would have anything to do with these people?
Well, being the son of a preacher man, I know how it used to be, but I'm glad that I'm far away from it now.
And a couple comments in the chat from Mary, who says, we have 12 years of public education, add 4 more years, then it's called socialism. And Edward answers, believe it or not, Blue Cross and Blue Shield were once described or once labeled as socialist.
Well, again, I would say that you need to go back and get a good definition of socialism and see how it was accounted for in Germany and now Russia and China. Of course, China is not totally a socialist country. It has probably about half capitalists, and about half of the activities going on there is owned by the Communist Party.
Edward says, in response to Diane's earlier comment, what I think must be, quote, respected is people's right to believe what they believe. That doesn't mean we have to agree. And Kent asks, given our state constitution is strongly against state government supporting religious organizations such as parochial schools, how is it that our government indirectly gives support to parochial schools?
That's a good question. We should bring it up to the legislature.
If our director of government affairs, Tori, was here, she would have a lot to tell you about how often she brings this up to members of our state legislator. Okay, Diane is saying, don't mix up socialism and communism and fascism. Nazi Germany was never communist and Russia was never socialist.
Agreed.
Okay. Let's see, going back to the chat, people often call something socialism when the government is doing something they don't want it to do. And Edward says, the argument is that money is given to the parents, not the schools. Yeah, the voucher issue. But it still does funnel taxpayer money to religious schools, so.
Well, but if you look at the results of vouchers, you find that about 49% of the people do not always spend the money for the education, or all of the money for the education of their children. And the quality of the education has been deemed severely much poorer with voucher supplies than going to a public school.
Yeah, I know, Joe, you've done a lot of work on this subject, education in general, and the influence of vouchers and school choice and everything. It's a topic we could spend hours on this one.
Yes, we could.
And from Facebook, Alex is, thank you, Alex, helpfully giving us some definitions here. In communism, the state controls the means of production. Socialism, the people control the means of production. In capitalism, an oligarch controls the means of production. Modern feudalism. I think that's a pretty good definition.
Okay, go back to, and people controls the means of production.
People
Well, what their meaning is, the people would be represented by the government,
Yeah.
which owns the means of production.
Let's see. Let me make sure we've hit all the questions. I think that's all of the questions that have been submitted. If anyone has anything else, please feel free to put it in the chat or the Q&A.
Well, I appreciate everyone showing up, listening, asking questions. That makes it worthwhile. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming tonight. And if you would like to see more of the Secular Speaker series, we always have some interesting things coming up. And I'm just going to put a little link here in the chat to our calendar of events. The next thing we have on our calendar is on May 2nd at 10 a.m. And Richard Dewey will be speaking on Humanist Meditation, a Practical Approach, and that will be presented by our friends at HSGP. So thank you everyone for coming today.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.